We are ready to make a start and continue with our next panel. So we will continue to be talking about rethinking Europe's East-West divide. And this time the focus is on rethinking Europe's East-West divide and European integration in a new geopolitical era. We have another fascinating group of speakers for this panel. Three of them will be joining us online. So we have Maria Popova, who is an associate professor of political science at McGill University. She's also the director of the Jean Monnet Center in Montreal, and also is the editor of Cambridge Element series of politics and society from Central Europe to Central Asia. She has worked on the rule of law and democracy in Europe. Her recent research she has recently published on judicial and anti-corruption reforms in post-Maidan Ukraine. And her new book with Oksana Shebel is On the Roots of the Russo-Ukrainian War, and it's entitled Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States. It's now available in all the best bookstores, out by Polity Press. And then we have joining us as well online from the LSC. We are very happy to have Denisa Kostovicova. She is an associate professor of global politics and director of LISI, which is London School of Economics research on Southeastern Europe at the European Institute at the LSC. She has worked on conflict and peace processes with a particular focus on post-conflict reconstruction and transnational justice. She has also recently published a very interesting book, which is called A Reconciliation by Stealth, How People Talk About War Crimes, and has also worked on Kosovo, edited a number of volumes on rethinking reconciliation, transitional justice after conflict as well. She's currently working on a project about justice interactions and peace building, and also very much interested in European integration and regional security post-conflict reconstruction. Then we also have Dr. Monika Sus. She's an associate professor of political science at the Institute of Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences and a senior researcher at the Center for International Security at the Hertie School in Berlin, where she leads a Horizon 2020 project entitled Engage. Her research focuses at the intersection of international relations, study of European Union and foreign security policy and defense. And last but not least, we have here in the flesh, we're very lucky to have Professor Ivan Krastev. He's the director of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Europe and is also a fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences. Currently, we are also very lucky to have him, and he is a visiting fellow at the European Study Center at St. Anthony's. He has worked and published widely and exclusively on Europe, and we are very, very happy. A very provocative book as well called After Europe, and we are very lucky to have our speakers joining us today. And what we will do, we will start first with Maria. Maria, the floor is yours. We have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So because I haven't followed the conference yesterday and today, I hope my remarks will fit into what you're talking about. But given the sort of the topic, and I wondered what really do I want, what are some points I want to make here about the East-West divide, and I went with some, in some ways, some meta comments about our responsibility, what we can do, our profession, and how can we address this, and how can we think about the East-West divide in Europe. And I basically want to make 3 points. The first one is that we really need to start reevaluating the regional studies silos in both research and in teaching, and start doing East-West comparisons, both in our research and in our teaching. I'll illustrate this with some examples of why I think that. The second point is that I think we need to reevaluate some concepts and measures that we use, because some of them are the sort of the artifact of the East-West silos, and we need to see if we're not actually using different words to describe the same phenomena, which really is a problem. And thirdly, I want to say a couple of things about positionality as researchers, and what that means for us who are researching these topics. So on the first point of sort of trying to really break down these silos, I think it comes primarily from the realization that sort of 30 years after the collapse of the communist regimes, if we continue keeping the post-communist and post-Soviet labels in both research and in teaching, we end up kind of surreptitiously privileging the communist legacy variable over other variables. And especially in the case of the post-Soviet region, we end up having a sort of implicit centering of Russia as the center of the Soviet Union, and sort of artificially tying the countries that were part of the Soviet state back to a Russia sphere of influence. I mean, the Baltic countries were objecting this from the very start, but at this point, many others are objecting to this lumping as well. And I think it definitely has hindered Ukraine's progress in EU integration, as it is continually seen as part of the Russian sphere of influence, so to speak, due to the post-Soviet label. And one example I want to give here from teaching is that this year in my department at McGill, we reformed our comprehensive exams and in comparative politics. And what we did was we proposed actually to get rid of the categorization of Soviet, post-Soviet and post-communist region versus European Union versus Western Europe, because these were the options that students had. And we lumped it all together, and we said that they can choose as fields for their comprehensive exams either Europe as a whole or European Union with a focus on EU institutions. And we got some pushback from a colleague who's been teaching Italian politics for several decades. And the pushback was, well, no, we need to continue separating Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and we need to keep the Eastern Europe and Russia as a region, and Western Europe and the EU as the other region. I mean, ultimately he was outvoted and we moved ahead, but the point is that there is quite a bit of work to be done still in realizing that in fact we need to be integrating, or at this point we are 20 years behind on this. We need the teaching to also reflect the fact that Eastern and Western Europe are integrated in the EU together mostly, and those Eastern European countries like Moldova and Ukraine and Georgia, Belarus, if there is regime change, etc., may eventually also go in this direction. And one of the examples that we gave in the debate about why it makes sense to actually integrate the areas is that, for example, my last article on the Ukrainian judiciary, on judicial reform and the role of of informality in judicial politics was published in a special issue of the German Law Journal, together with 12 other articles on European countries, all talking about informality in the judiciary. So clearly, this integration in research is happening, and it needs to be it needs to continue. Now, the second point that sort of flows from this, what it means to sort of de-emphasize now the legacy variable and start thinking about other variables that may be leading and maybe explaining variation better, is the point about the concepts and measures that we use. And I think we have a bit of an issue here where one of the divides between analyzing East and West is reflected in the fact that we might be calling very similar phenomena by different names, depending, and using different terms depending on where we observe these phenomena. And I'll give you here an example from my research on corruption and anti-corruption, and a bit of a foray into Canadian politics. So right now, Canadian politics is gripped by a scandal, the basics of which are the following. A company was given a government contract to create a COVID Arrive Canada app so that people could register for contact tracing when they travel. And the original budget for the app was $80,000. By the end of the process, when the app was unveiled, the government had already spent $60 million instead of $80,000. And then it turned out that the $60 million contract was won by a company of only 3 people, who then subcontracted the work to other companies, but in the process pocketed several million in profit from this subcontracting. And it also turned out that these 3 people have very close connections with the government department giving out the contract. Now, a lot of you in the room working on Eastern Europe, you just know that if this sort of scandal had been happening in Eastern Europe, we would be talking about it in terms of corruption, kickbacks, graft, thinking about, what investigating anti-corruption bodies being put on this case of how did this happen? How did a contract for $80,000 balloon into $60 million? And how was it given to a company that has only 3 employees and is registered in a random residential address. If you look at the Canadian coverage of it, however, the word corruption is not mentioned once. This is talked about in terms of wrongdoing, potential violations of best practices. It is being investigated by the auditor, by something called the Auditor General, as opposed to an anti-corruption body. So the point is here that the Canadian public, out of this scandal, which is a major scandal, does not get any signaling that Canada is a corrupt country. It gets signaling about waste, about government not doing things efficiently, about public money being lost to civil servants who are not very good at doing their jobs. They're not delivering things cost effectively. And I think that what this leads to is actually some real effects downstream on corruption indices, which are corruption perception indices, which are the main tools that we use for measuring actual corruption. I mean, the fine print says that these are corruption perceptions indices rather than corruption incidence indices. They're very clear about that. But in reality, they're used as proxies for corruption incidents. Nobody says Ukraine is perceived to be too corrupt and it cannot join the EU because it's perceived to be corrupt. Everybody says Ukraine cannot join the EU because it's too corrupt. So, and the point is that if we're not using the same words to describe similar phenomena, people who are not just the experts, but the publics living in different countries are primed in ways which are significantly different. Basically, if you ask an average Canadian, is Canada a corrupt country? They will probably tell you no. But it's reflected in the indices. I've actually looked at Canada's indices over time. It's basically not only low, but it's a flat line. So and there have been indices, there have been scandals similar to the Arrive Can scandal that is at the top of the agenda right now. There have been, every 5 or 10 years, there's a scandal of that sort. These scandals, even though they're constantly talked about, make no blip on the corruption perception index because they're simply not perceived as and not talked about as corruption. And I think that is something that we need to examine in more systematic ways. A second, much shorter example that I'll give you, again from my work on rule of law and judicial reform, is that the literature on connections between, if we use it in a neutral language as possible, connections between judges and prosecutors and lawyers, professional informality connections. In the US literature, for example, is called collegiality, judicial collegiality. In the Eastern European literature, it's called collusive networks. Even though really we're talking about very similar things. We're talking about informal professional relationships between different parts of the legal system that may be affecting, and there's a lot of research showing that collegiality in the judiciary affects decisions. Sounds very different normatively if we say collusive networks affect decisions than collegiality, right? So I think we need a lot more work in this direction to really make sure that we're talking about the same things using the same terms. And to do that, I think we really need to encourage cross-national, cross-regional comparisons, research projects that include both East and West, and really be cognizant of these issues. Now, the last thing that I'll say about positionality, and I think this is not a topic I need to go into a lot of depth with this kind of audience, but what I want to use just a minute here to urge people who are sort of mixed positionality. I have recently realized that there's a lot of us with this mixed positionality of maybe, at some point having been locals in Eastern Europe, but at this point being locals in Western Europe or North America, that I've noticed by looking back at my own work, that the Eastern European positionality earlier on led me to think that a lot of the problems that I was observing in Eastern Europe were unique to Eastern Europe, and was the worst possible sort of variation on various phenomena. It's only when I've accrued all these years and a Western positionality that I'm starting to see that there are some commonalities that need to be that really need to be explored. And there's a lot of different versions of this call. Lea Yupi, for example, has talked about how Eastern European leftists need to be listened to by Western European leftists, that there's a lot that Eastern European leftists can contribute. Teresa Hendel has talked about Eastern European feminists, for example, explaining Russian imperialism to Western European feminists. Milada Bahudova has talked about scholars of populism explaining explaining populism overall to Western European specialists. So there's a lot of calls in that direction, but I'd like to join them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maria.
Should I just continue?
Yes, please.
All right. Hi there. Thank you very much for the invitation and for this quite an enjoyable task to rethink Europe's East-West divide. I knew that speaking after Maria would be a tall order, so I will echo some things and then maybe sort of provide a rather different perspective on Maria's point on especially on legacy. So I would like to use war as a prism through which to assess and rethink Europe's East-West divide. And what I will do is I will reflect on mainly on the conflict, or rather conflicts associated with violent dissolution of former Yugoslavia, the region of Western Balkans. And I will also draw implications for the Ukraine war. So I'd just like to, while doing that and keeping this idea of East-West divide, we'll think in terms of geographies of division, but also what I'd like us to rethink is the basis of East-West divide. So I will suggest to you that we need to look at, and from this prism of war, state-society relations as one of the biggest challenges to the unity, sort of in terms of basically creating a space where values, norms related to politics and economics and societies converge. which also, I think, reveals the EU, the inability of EU and whole Europeanization project to address this challenge, which in turn deepens this divide. And I would also like to reflect on how we study this in the context of EU or European studies, or studies of Europeanization taken more broadly. So, I'd like to go back then first look at the region of Western Balkans as it is now. And if we look at the region, the conflict, depending on exactly which parts of the region we are talking about, but we're basically definitely over 2 decades into the peace building and almost as many years into the European integration process. And yet what we are seeing in larger part of the region, excluding Croatia and Slovenia, of course, we see that most indicators of political and economic progress indicate regressive trends. So we see democratic backsliding, and we see the entrenchment of corruption, and we see that informality is on the rise. And what we see also in terms of kind of peace-war, we have kind of a hot peace in place with a bunch of frozen and unresolved conflicts that are very easily kind of flipped into more or less hot conflicts, such as kind of the recent violence that we've seen in Kosovo. So what I think is at the root of the problem, and that is the transformation of state and society relation through war, and specifically through war economy that completely restructures societies and basically turns them, if you like, on their head. I think the biggest problem that we've seen in this region is the use of war and the political economy through the establishment of networks and of relations that span, if you like, the area of politics, economics, military, paramilitary actors, also some religious institutions, and of course organized crime elements. And what is important in terms of kind of this longue durée is an extraordinary ability of these networks to fold into and adapt to the peace-building project that in this region overlaps with Europeanization. So, as a result, we have weak states, and a colleague of mine and I call them persistently weak states, because the politicians that are at the head of these states, they realize that it is not necessarily in their failure for these states to, in their interest for these states to fail, so they make sure they keep them weak, so that the weak rule of law, they can exploit that, it works for them. So some of course, the benefits are distributed to the population, but making sure that they don't get too good. That the rule of law is not too strong or too developed. Again, scholars, I think, have latched on this concept of state capture, which I think is a very problematic and inaccurate description of the problem. Whereas I think it is much more apt, and I think I've seen now this some scholars have caught up talking about societal capture, right? So you have a really a situation, a paradoxical situation where something, and I will here give an example of corruption, is both a problem and a solution. Okay. it is a problem because we know that without sort of with corruption you cannot entrench the rule of law, sort of transparency, etc. Sort of that undermines democratization, etc., etc. Sort of feeds into the weak state problem. But on the other hand, for people who live in those environments, that is the solution, right? That because of the sort of the way system works, they know that if they know someone, right, so basically they circumvent the procedures, they can help themselves. So I could just give you a quote that we've had in research that we did in Kosovo a while ago on exactly on this issue, is where a person told us, says, I'm not frustrated by corruption, but he said, I'm frustrated because I don't know who to bribe, right? So in this context, you see that the person is empowered because they are not networked and they are not connected. So this brings me to the problem of EU and EU integration. So if we look at the Western Balkans now, having understood where it stands, I think the issue here is that the scope of transition, and I don't know what Maria has said on the legacy, actually presents a double challenge. It's a challenge of the legacy of post-communism and also of war. So when we speak about the Western Balkans, we see sort of a double transition, sort of ongoing at the same time, which is a post-communist transition and post-conflict transition, kind of interweaved sort of together. And the EU has done just about everything that it could have in terms of kind of sort of different policy mechanisms, from foreign policy to enlargement and to coming up sort of the ideas with regional sort of cooperation and collaboration, sort of the, collaboration and supporting the work of the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, but that has not worked. So this kind of multiplication in sort of an almost add-on automatic way of different policy instruments has not really addressed the problems. And the reason is because of these conflict networks, really very effective way of folding into the post-conflict state, right, while keeping the relations to different sort of parts of the state and society, and entrenching their relational power. And of course, a lot can be said about the problem of EU's multiple sort of policy instruments, which have often worked against each other than together. So basically, when we speak of the sort of East-West divide, I think sort of my argument here begins to emerge is kind of what kind of East are we talking about, right? And we can see that sort of there is a complete reconfiguration of the divide, if it still exists, right? Maybe it's blending and merging, blurring in some areas along the lines of the sort of old Iron Curtain, and popping up and reconfiguring elsewhere. So basically, you have the countries of the Balkans, you have the enclave within the EU, right? Russia's influence is growing. In Serbia, we have public opinions for the first time where majority does not want to join the EU, right? And I don't see this changing anytime soon. Rather, I see here kind of a new division emerging. So this now just brings me to a few remarks on sort of how do we then disconnect this this kind of emerging picture from the perspective of the war on Ukraine. Again, very interesting. The war has jolted the EU into action, accelerating the European integration process in Ukraine and Moldova, as well as accelerating it in the Balkans. But I would just say this kind of logic, right, that this again sort of attention that EU is now sort of directing towards sort of further east Ukraine way and down southeast towards the Balkans, that it's going to create again sort of a unified sort of space and maybe reverse some of those trends. I think that is very problematic. In fact, what I can see happening is inter-regional competition and entrenchment of division. In some areas of the Balkans, this kind of accelerated procedure in case of Ukraine is taken received with much resentment. And others are also saying, well, that's kind of fine as long as Europe is channeling further funds and money, and we still pretend to reform. We can still benefit. And I would say either way, very dangerous, because this is not kind of how some sort of unity is being forged. And lastly, on a point on the conflict, on the war in Ukraine, and back to my argument and prisms to sort of how war changes state-society relations, I think this is something where both as scholars and practitioners, we sort of have to be really careful in terms of how we diagnose what the problem is and what is the solution, and lastly, how we study it. So if we look at Ukraine sort of prior to the initial conflicts, sort of Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, we would study Ukraine, let's say not very differently from studying other post-conflict states, right? Post-communist states in Eastern Europe. However, the war, the large-scale war, has now completely changed the game. And if anything, Ukraine, regardless of how the war ends, is going to emerge as a kind of problem that the Balkans has presented to the EU 30 years ago, and that EU has not been able to really deal with effectively. We see at the moment contradictory trends in terms of what is war doing to Ukraine, to the state in Ukraine. On the one hand, war is strengthening the state. So, for example, increasing its power to collect taxes, right, which is an interesting development. But there is very interesting research emerging from scholars based here in UK, as well as in the US, that actually points to this kind of more pernicious effect on war, right, where war does not make states but unmakes them, and creation of these kinds of pernicious connections, for example, with contracts having to do with drones, etc., which has emerged as the biggest problem in reconstructing the societies in the Western Balkans. So that basically just brings me to my conclusion that what I sort of fear is that we do see sort of reconfiguration of the divide, a redrawing of this boundary. And also sort of a part of it is that some sort of societies are being kind of look different, sort of former Eastern European societies, Eastern Bloc societies rather, look very, very sort of different amongst themselves. So, as I said, this point about East-East division rather than just West-East division. And just to conclude, I too had, like Maria, a point about silos, but I wasn't thinking in terms of silos, in terms of West and East. rather I was thinking in terms of silos and how we study, let's say more broadly, Europeanization, different parts of the process. And what strikes me is that scholars have studied either foreign policy or, for example, enlargement, and there has been very little effort to imaginatively rethink what is the problem that is presented and how can it be studied within the paradigms of which arguments, right, or approaches to how sort of Europeanization work. And I think and this is also kind of where we as scholars are kind of almost implicit in these sort of underpinning or legitimizing kind of the policy making, right? That kind of is completely divided across different, if you like, areas of what EU is doing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. If we can, Monika.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. And before I start, let me just say that I just landed from the US a couple of hours ago, so I'm hugely jet lagged. I will really try to make sense, but if I'm not making sense, please forgive me. And of course, it's also quite intimidating to follow basically the great contributions of both Maria and Denisa. But I will try to make a few points, focusing perhaps a bit more indeed on the, on different division lines within the European Union and how I see the East-West divide as someone coming from Poland and having lived in both Poland and Germany for the better part of the last 20 years. See this both as a scholar, but also, of course, let's say from the more practitioners-oriented perspective, if I may call it that. So my introductory point would perhaps be that, of course, in the Russian war in Ukraine, and this will be, let's say, the departure for the three aspects that I would like to mention in a moment, has, of course, exposed the historically rooted East-West divide. But at the same time, I feel like the war has also demonstrated new division lines within the European Union across different dimensions. I am not talking only about the geographical dimension, but also about economic dimensions, social dimensions. And I feel like, on one hand, the EU is definitely much more united, and I will come to that in a second. But at the same time, there are new division lines that are basically threatening the coherence of the European integration, perhaps even stronger than before the war. But at the same time, and coming, let's say, to the three remarks I would like to make, if we try to look at this from a more positive point of view, we can, of course, also argue or make the argument that the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, to some extent, brought member states closer to each other, at least with respect to the perception of the Russian threat. And now, again, as someone coming from Poland and also, having several conversations with colleagues from this part of Europe, so to say, the Baltic states, but also the UK, we, of course, shared the perception on Russia for quite some time, but the perception has not been shared by many countries in Western Europe. And now, of course, there are some countries that still perhaps not fully share the threat perception, but there are definitely countries that move closer to the hawkishness that we've been seeing and observing in the most eastern and southern part of the European Union. And again, I'm including UK here because UK has actually always had a very similar position to the countries at the eastern flank and in the east. So countries like France, for example, or Italy, for that matter, even, let's say, have now a very changed threat perception than 2 years ago, and I think there's something that we can leverage. And I'm not naive. I am not saying that the whole EU now shares a very, united threat perception on different issues. We still have, of course, our differences. And apart of Russia, we have also very different threat perceptions regarding China, for example. Another problem that I think the EU is a bit sleepwalking, and there is definitely something to be, told about the East-West divide with this in this context, but staying in the context what the war actually has taught us in terms of this division lines. And the 3 points that I would like to make is for the starters. So for my first point, I would like to make a call for inclusive leadership. What the has actually showed is that the leadership of countries like France and Germany, we've talked about for many years about the Franco-German tandem. This is simply not something that we can have as a useful tool to push for any kind of European cooperation in this new geopolitical era that is also, to some extent, the topic of this conference. So we definitely need new formats for that, and the war actually unleashed the potential of leaderships of small states like Estonia, like Czech Republic. We saw, several examples and several attempts of these countries to push for certain proposals with the European Union and both NATO, for example, for joint procurement of ammunition. And these countries have been hugely successful in these endeavors. And I would argue that still the division lies, of course, they still exist, as I said in the beginning, but there is something positive that we can actually build upon from these developments if we, let's say, in a more aware way, continue to include different countries in different constellations. And as I said, have a bit more inclusive leadership in several aspects of European integration. And these developments basically also show that material power is not the only thing that matters. We have very strong and very wealthy countries of the European Union who struggle in leadership position. I am talking now about Germany, for example, whereas we have countries that are perhaps not so strongly economically equipped, as I said, for example, the smaller countries of like the Baltic states. But the relative power actually matters most in this moment, or perhaps not most, but it matters at least in an equal way. And again, I think there's something that we could learn as a lesson from these changed dynamics of leadership within the European Union in the aftermath of the war. And last point on that, I also do think that only with this inclusive forms of leadership, we can actually talk about the effective way of pursuing foreign policy within the European Union. So the old mechanisms are definitely not fit for the purpose anymore. Now, coming to the second point, and these points are, of course, also interrelated to some extent. I also definitely take on board the comments that especially Denisa made about re-emerging boundaries beyond the European Union. I'm talking here about neighborhood, Western Balkans, but also, of course, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. And again, my call here would be to build upon what is happening to some extent, but again, we need more of that. And I'm talking about different formats of mini and multilateral cooperation within the European Union. There are some, let's say, instances of cooperation emerging, for example, between Poland and Spain, which has never been the case. These two countries fought for a very long time. There's basically nothing that unites them. And now they both realize, well, to some extent, we have, there's a certain migration risks from different countries, from different regions, but in the end, we share problems that they're actually joined that are shared in these countries. And I think that we, again, the EU will enlarge. I strongly believe in that, but it won't happen anytime soon. And both for this interim period, we need to cooperate much more beyond the European Union with countries of the neighborhood, with countries of the Western Balkans, but also in order to keep the momentum for the enlargement. I do think that certain multilateral cooperation formats within the European Union will have to be stronger in order, again, to keep the momentum and to convince countries that are perhaps a little less supportive towards the enlargement of the EU for different reasons. And this is not perhaps the topic of this conversation, but I do see a huge risks of running only through unilateral formats. I don't think this is possible with EU27, definitely not within enlarged EU. So I would here make a call for, let's say, more flexible formats of cooperation, but of course at the same time they have to be coordinated by some central mechanisms. But again, this is perhaps a bit another topic. And then finally, and coming to the final point I would like to make is that, and this relates a lot actually to what Maria was talking about, the raising awareness of shared problems. You made a great example with corruption. I also felt that, for example, the problems of democratic backsliding have been singled out as a problem of Central Eastern Europeans for quite some time, which is simply not true, because we see a rise of populism, of right-wing populism across the board of the European Union and also beyond. But again, we use different labels, as you rightly said, to basically to describe it and to talk about it. But my issue here is that I do think that, and we see with populism, I will stay with this example for a moment, that we see that many countries across Europe, both within the EU but also beyond, really do share the same problem of populism. And although, of course, populism has different, faces and facets and specific conditions in every country, in principle, there are similar causes of populism across the board. Again, simply part of the public feels left behind and decides to vote for populist parties. And of course, ignoring, or even worse, which is also happening, also very much in Poland nowadays, mocking the voters of populist parties doesn't lead anywhere, and we should have actually learned this lesson before. But again, this is definitely something that goes way beyond East-West divide and can actually, as something that is shared as a problem, as a challenge, also to some extent have an integrative function if now communities of liberal parties, non-governmental organizations, scholars for that matter, actually, realize that we share the same problem. If we share the same problem, we can, of course, also talk about common solutions. And this is, of course, not only populism, climate change, migration, security, and you name it. There are many problems that we share, but we simply are not enough aware of this shared factor, let's say, to these problems. And let me just finish with a very final, perhaps, call that again, I do think that the only way for the European integration to go further and actually to progress within the next couple of decades and couple of years is to really make itself aware of these division lines that we have and consciously try to make something really against it and to undertake something against it. And here, final point, the elections to the European Parliament are, of course, also, let's say, a very good starting point of discussions, whether we actually see that the people who run for European Parliament, do they all only focus on their domestic constituencies, or is there something like a shared public space in terms of voters that actually are concerned about similar problems across the board, whether from the Baltic states, Portugal, Czech Republic, or France? And I do think that as scholars, there is definitely something that we can actively do, and Maria talked about it a lot, in order, to push for this rising awareness and for this common space to emerge to some extent, and in this way to help the European integration progressing, let's say, a bit more equally and a bit less of this division lines. Thank you so much.
Now we move over to Ivan.
Thank you very much, and first thank you for the opportunity to listen and to see the project. And for me, it's also very interesting because it's kind of a generational project. It comes from a certain generation that has a totally different experiences to East-West. Probably most of you has a career in the West much more based. This border is not very much something that is border that you're crossing with particular emotions. I'm saying this because from this point of view, I do believe every academic research is based on a certain type of experiences. The time, what you have experienced, and so on. Going from, and this is why reflecting on the experience of our generation, there is one thing that is most important, and this is how radically things can change in different directions, but the pace of change. And I'm saying this because one of the interesting stories, and this is my first argument, normally when we talk about the unproductive nature of the East-West divide, this was very much perceived that the East was on the losing side. My first argument is going to be that one of the major problems with the East-West divide was that it was based on the assumption that the East is going to change and the West is going to remain the same. As a result of it, thinking in terms of the East-West divide, the West was blind to a major changes that is happening in the Western society political model, and also quite blind to the fact to what extent the Western democratic political model was very much precondition of the Cold War. The nature of the social contract was very much based on the Cold War. the existence of a strong communist party in some of these countries, the existence of Soviet Union is basically trying to talk to these parties. So when this happened, as a result of it, 30 years later, we're in a moment in which basically the West is totally surprised by everything happening. And the East basically is kind of unhappy to realize that there are many things that for many of the East Europeans are obvious and which are not for the West. From this point of view, on the level of corruption, this is true, but this is even much more dramatic change that started in the beginning of the century, after the failure of the first kind of IMF and World Bank reforms, where a major change was done. Before, the idea was that poor countries tend to be corrupt. And after it turned out that the corrupt countries are poor. This is not the same. This is not the same assumption. And from this point of view, trying to explain the failure of certain policies as an implementation of the policies, allowed not to question certain policies. And from this point of view, many of the problems that the European Union was facing on the periphery was really reduced to the problem of implementation. I'm saying this because from this point of view, the war in Ukraine is much more important, not because of kind of the symptom, the discourse that you see, but because it changes the major assumptions on which European Union is based. All the major security assumptions on which the European Union is based are dramatically questioned. The first is that economic interdependence is enough to secure peace. And listen, we can ridicule as much as we want people like Merkel, but this was at the heart of the European Union. You are trading with people so strongly that you're going to decrease the incentives to start the war. From this point of view, Nord Stream 2 was not a commercial project, it was a security project. We are going to buy so much gas from Russia that they cannot start a war. And by the way, this is how it worked between Germany and France after the war. This was the way the European Union was dealing with everybody in a certain way. This is how the West was dealing with the East after 1989. It did not work in the case of Russia. Why? This is a long conversation. But in a certain way, European Union, when you get the idea that economic interdependency is the major source of security, when you see that economic interdependency can become a major source of vulnerability, when the Russian gas basically stopped flying to Europe, this is pushing to reconsider the same project dramatically. I mean, the foundation of the projects. And then you go for the second major assumptions, the United States security guarantees.
I think that we have, maybe this microphone, the other one is working. I think that was the online audience.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. And then comes the story of the second major assumptions on which European Union security was based. And this was basically the United States security guarantees. And then it was quite obvious during the beginning of the war, but then you had the Trump phenomenon. And even beyond Trump, it's very clear that the nature of the transatlantic relations is going to change based on many things, including the totally different demographic nature of the American societies today. But listen, if this is not the case, how European Union is going to think about itself in security terms? And the third is hard power. After the Iraqi war, Europeans looked around and said, hard power does not buy enough. And there was, in my view, a very rational debate saying, investing in hard power does not make a lot of sense. Americans had so much hard power, what they managed to achieve. So as a result of it, European Union totally focused on economic power and soft power. And then comes the war. And as a result of the war, basically we discovered that certain anti-investment in the military capabilities, which were totally legitimate in the previous period. So it's not that people were idiotic of what they were doing. You're working with different assumptions how the world is going to develop. And this type of assumptions were questioned. When the war started, basically Ukraine has ammunition for 6 weeks, Germany for 6 days. At the moment, Russia is producing 2 to 3 times more ammunition than the United States and the European Union taken together. And I'm saying this because it's interesting enough to see how different was the European response to COVID crisis, where Europe managed to create the industrial base and in a certain way continent scale response, industrial response for producing vaccines. And how unable this is to do it when it comes to the production of ammunition. I'm saying this because, by the way, comparing the responses of states to COVID and to the war is extremely interesting because it's also very interesting for the Russian case. If you see and want to understand how the Russian is fighting the war, see what they have been doing with COVID, and they did exactly the same. By the way, most of the mobilizations that they're doing is for financial means. This is not a kind of a great patriotic war mobilization. Most of them goes on the level of the governance, companies, and so on, through employment and financial resources. I'm saying this because then we go to the first important problem that this comes, and this is the mobilization of power of nationalism. Ukraine is a great example of the mobilization power of civic nationalism. And for a very long period, death and sacrifice was not part of the social contract in the West. So I don't believe that governments has the feeling that they have the right of people to be asked to die for their country. And this was one of the major successes of the HIP. So this is not the failure of the project, this was the success of the project. And this was the famous Brechtian line that I pity nations that need heroes. But then the war comes and you need heroes, and if you're going to see the reverse, in Maidan there were European flags in Kiev. After the war started, there were Ukrainian flags in the European capitals. But as a result of it, the war became a European moment and nationalist moment at the same time. And you can see this style of nationalistic mobilization everywhere, because in a certain way, European Union was never being constructed as a war project. And the third thing, which is also in my view critically important, contrary to what normally is said, the war in Ukraine marks the end of the Cold War frame. When the war started, basically, particularly President Biden and others insisted that it's going to be framed as a clash between democracies and totalitarian regimes. It didn't work like this. Most of the countries outside of the West did not respond to this, but even to be honest, within the West, we much more adopted the Ukrainian view of the war, which was a post-colonial discourse, than the Cold War discourse. In the Cold War discourse, Russians were fleeing the war, running out of Putin should be heroes. In the post-colonial discourse, they're Russians. And this is what happened. And in my view, this is quite important because these are radical changes. And then the question is how it affects the East-West divide. And the first argument was because, of course, there was a credit to the East because of the fact that the war was on the East. But if you go on the opinion polling, and this is something that Ingrid Tanesh was referring for, because we have been doing polling for the last 2 years, European Council for Foreign Relations, you're going to see something very important. Forget what the governments are saying, just go on the level of the public opinion, and you're going to see that in the beginning there was a certain East-West divide based on what you fear. The West was fearing nuclear war. The East was fearing occupation. But then, when you start to see what is the support for Ukraine, for giving weapons, for going for a peaceful settlement, and so on, the East-West divide disappeared, and what came back was the East-East divide. And then you see the borders of the previous empires. Countries that have been part of the Russian Empire stand very strongly behind Ukraine. And this is not only Poland and the Baltic states, but countries like Finland, to a certain extent some of the Scandinavian countries. Then you go to the Ottoman part. Bulgaria and Serbia agrees. Public opinion poll is totally different where the public stands. Habsburg Empire, like whole, is quite divided. The Czechoslovaks are not on the same place. I'm saying this because in a certain way, the moment the war comes, long history comes back. So,
Sorry, can I, would it be possible to ask you to move to the other side?
yeah, I can move anywhere, yeah.
Because
I can move from the east to the west in order to bridge the divide.
yeah, sorry, I don't know. I mean, again, if you don't mind standing, I think this might be.
I can stand.
Yeah, so I think that you will be able, then this microphone will capture as well. Yeah.
So my major argument is that, in a strange way, what is happening is that the moment the geopolitics enters, the way the European Union tries to redefine its own security identity, this West divide is also not particularly helpful. Because, strangely enough, by the way, the most interesting country on the polling is Romania. You expect that Romania is going to look like Poland. It looks like Italy. And from this point of view, it is quite important because we're talking about major understanding. So, what is then going to happen with this kind of important divides, and what basically kind of European Union is going to get? And I'm saying this because, as I'm going to end up in this, we tried in a polling to, in a certain way, to test the question, if you have all these, what Jonathan is going to say, competitive emergencies, how people identify themselves. So we asked the people in the 12 EU member states, both East and West, out of the 5 big crises that come for the last 15 years. You have climate, you have the economic crisis after the global financial crisis, you have COVID, you have migration, you have Ukraine. Which one you perceived as the most important when you look at the future? And interestingly enough, you end up with 5 crisis tribes, which are almost equal size, but they have a very different geographies. It's on the south, it's about economy and COVID. COVID is number 1 here in UK. And interestingly enough, what comes as COVID is that people who remember COVID were people that were very much in step with the government actions during COVID, not simply people that basically have been much more affected in medical terms. So in a certain way, all of the crisis tribes are much more creating their identity based on what they see the failure of the national governments of the European Union to respond to this crisis. They're kind of a tribes based on vulnerabilities. Of course, when it comes to the war, you're going to see basically in places like Estonia, more than 60% of the population is going to come as the war as the major crisis. But in France, it's going to be only 6%. And most of them people who are older than 70. I'm saying all this because one of the biggest problems in the situation in which we are is that this is not simply that European Union is kind of taking certain policy actions which will try to finish certain projects that get started, for example, in 1991 or 1992. The word enlargement has a totally different meaning when it comes to Ukraine or Moldova and so on, and not for cultural reasons, but for the reasons of the fact that in order for the Ukraine to be integrated, European Union should be totally different type of a union, talking about a country which is in fact a war. And also the problem of inclusion and exclusion is also quite interesting. You remember, during the migration period, the idea was that East Europeans are totally anti-migrant, and that Poles basically get millions of the Ukrainians. 8% of the households in Poland had been personally taking care of the Ukrainians. This was inclusion. But this inclusion also was very much at the cost of exclusion. At the same time, if you go on the opinion polls after Gaza, you're going to see that more than 80% said, we don't want migrants from Middle East, we don't have migrants from Africa. So in my view, and this is my last point, one of the things that has changed directly, and this is why I do believe your process for your project for East-West divide is very important, is that East-West divide and thinking in terms of East-West divide, instead in thinking in terms of East basically manage to catch up with the West and basically trying to get there, is becoming one of the obstacles for understanding how deep and profound changes the European Union is going through. So from this point of view, I am not much more putting on the academic part of it, but the fact that everybody is making just this type of a studies, where is East, where is the West, is a political consequences. And as I said, in my view, the political consequence is much more critical for the West than for the East. Thank you so much.
Thank you.